And first on the schedule is Andy Baker's large head coming to us from presumably Glasgow, who is going to has some thoughts about Fred. So take it away, I guess.
Okay. Thanks, Nick, for trading places today. That's been very helpful. I'd like to thank the organizers for this nice conference. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there. I'm particularly pleased that they gave me a slot to talk about Fred. Because I was thinking about this for a couple of weeks, I sort of began to think about it in terms of basically all of my mathematical career and the fact that Fred was always there. I never really did joint work with him or anything like that, but he was always there at various times, and I have a lot of memories about talking to him. So I thought I'd just go through some of the things I remember. I think when I was a beginning graduate student, I probably hadn't heard the name Fred Cohen, but in my first year, my advisor got a letter about Fred's illness, and he was very, very upset because he'd gone climbing with Fred a few years before in Devil's Lake and places. So that was my first awareness, and I'm not sure if I actually met Fred in 1977 at a Northwestern conference. It's possible he was there, but I think my first definite memory was a conference in Oxford in 1978. And the reason I remember this was that I arrived there the day before with some other Manchester people, and we went punting. And that's the only time in my life I've ever been punting. And I had this memory that we saw a boat. I think it was stuck in the mud. And on board it were 3 or 4 people who somehow vaguely looked like mathematicians. And later I discovered this was Fred, and I think Kathy, Joe Neisendorfer, and possibly Larry Taylor. I'm not sure quite what was going on. I think they may have got stuck in the mud, but that may be not quite right. So that was probably the first time I met Fred. Pretty memorable way to meet someone. I guess I saw a lot of Fred when I was in Chicago in the early 80s. He was always there at conferences. One of the things I really remember about Fred, I remember when his illness was, ongoing in the middle 70s or late 70s. I mean, there were various thoughts that he might never walk and certainly not climb again. And I do remember something that, really shows what Fred's determination was like. I went to Devil's Lake with Michael Barrett one weekend in 1981. And who should we see but Joe and Fred climbing? And, that to me was amazing. And I think many people probably have similar experiences with Fred. He was incredibly determined. He didn't let physical problems, grind him down. He seemed to get through it and do things that were pretty amazing. So throughout the 80s, I used to see him at conferences and things, and it would always be the same. Other people have mentioned this. You would see Fred, he'd say, "Hi, how's it going? What are you thinking about?" You'd start to tell him, and then he'd start telling you how he thought about that. And then eventually it would drift into him telling you what he was thinking about. And there was always a notepad. And there's a book, I think it's a biography of Erdos called something like "My Brain is Always Open." And I always thought Fred, that was Fred's slogan. I mean, you never saw him when he wasn't thinking about mathematics. And speaking of Erdos, probably a lot of people don't know this. About 20 years ago, when MathSciNet produced the collaboration tool, so you could find out your Erdos number, I looked mine up and I discovered it was 4, which surprised me until I realized that Fred actually had Erdos number 2 because he wrote a paper with someone called John Selfridge, who was a collaborator of Erdos. So, of course, the effect of that is that a lot of topologists have quite low Erdos numbers. So that was surprising. Okay, I guess my closest mathematical contact with Fred in the sense that I really used his work or thought about his work was in the last 15 years, I read a lot of his early work on homology of loop spaces and power operations and things. And that's the closest I came to really seriously engaging with his work because, you know, the kind of things Fred did was on the whole rather different from my interest. The very last time I saw Fred, I was never very into toric things, but I went to a toric conference in Belfast, and I was amazed to see not just Fred there, but also Larry Taylor, who I hadn't seen for a long time. I can't remember which year that was. It might have been about 15 years ago, or perhaps a bit less. But that was certainly the last time I actually saw Fred. But it was the usual story, you know, it was just like I'd seen him regularly for the last few years. He seemed to be, you know, exactly the same. But anyway, that was my last meeting with him. So, you know, I think Fred was a kind of constant presence in my mathematical career. And, you know, obviously it's very sad that he's no longer around. But at least this conference is drawing attention to younger people to his influence. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thanks for reminding me my Erdos number is apparently 3, thanks to this little note that I wrote with him and Ralph and when I was in graduate school. So that's good. Yeah. So thanks. I don't know if I have to ask for questions to Andy, but maybe not. But that was very nice. Yeah. So I guess we have about a 3-minute break, and then we'll have the next talk. So stay around because I guess we'll get set up for that.